Picture this, it's 1875, and a young woman named Margaret has just been caught by her father practicing waltz steps in her bedroom. The consequences? A month of prayer meetings, removal from social activities, and a prescribed reading list of moral improvement texts. Her crime wasn't theft, lying, or even speaking to a young man unchaperoned. She had dared to dance, alone in private, to imaginary music. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, even tyrannical. But to understand why Margaret's father reacted with such horror, we need to journey into one of history's most fascinating moral panics, the Victorian crusade against dancing. You might think you understand Victorian prudishness, the covered piano legs, the separate beaches for men and women, the fainting at the sight of an ankle. But the war on dancing reveals something far deeper and more complex than simple sexual repression. It was about control, class anxiety, medical pseudoscience, and a genuine belief that the human body itself was a battleground between salvation and damnation. This isn't just a quirky historical footnote, it's a window into how societies create and enforce moral boundaries, and how those boundaries shape generations. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're finding this fascinating, I'd love a like or subscribe. It really helps me bring you more stories like this. I'm always curious about our global community, so drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's continue this journey together. To understand why Victorians saw dancing as a pathway to hell, we need to travel back before Victoria ever took the throne. The story begins in the aftermath of the English Civil War, when Puritans briefly banned Christmas, theater, and yes, dancing. Though the monarchy was restored and official bans lifted, the Puritan mindset didn't disappear. It went underground, evolved, and emerged, transformed in the evangelical movements of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The Great Awakening that swept through Britain and America in the 1730s and 1740s brought a new intensity to Christian faith. Preachers like George Whitefield and John Wesley didn't just want believers. They wanted transformed souls who showed their salvation through disciplined bodies. Wesley, founder of Methodism, was particularly influential. He wrote extensively about the dangers of carnal pleasures, and dancing topped his list. In his 1743 sermon, The Use of Money, Wesley declared that dancing was the mother of numberless evils, and that no Christian could participate in it without endangering their immortal soul. But why dancing specifically? Wesley and his followers saw the human body as fundamentally corrupt, a vessel of sin that needed constant discipline. Dancing did the opposite. It celebrated the body, encouraged physical contact between unmarried people, and worst of all, it brought pleasure without purpose. In the Methodist worldview, every moment should be spent in productive labor or spiritual contemplation. Dancing was neither. This might have remained a minority view, confined to strict Methodist chapels, except for what happened next. The Industrial Revolution created a new middle class: factory owners, merchants, clerks, and professionals who needed to distinguish themselves from both the decadent aristocracy above and the unruly working classes below. They found their identity in respectability, and respectability meant controlling one's body. The emerging middle class faced a peculiar dilemma. The aristocracy had always danced. Elaborate court dances were part of diplomatic protocol, and country dances filled the ballrooms of every estate. The working classes danced too, in pubs, at fairs, during harvest celebrations. If the middle class wanted to be distinct, they needed their own approach to social entertainment. Some embraced highly regulated, desexualized forms of dance, but increasingly, many rejected dancing altogether as incompatible with their values of self-control, productivity, and moral superiority. This wasn't happening in isolation. The same period saw the rise of the temperance movement, campaigns against animal cruelty, and efforts to regulate working-class leisure. The body became a site of social reform. If Britain was to be a great Christian nation, its people needed disciplined Christian bodies. And disciplined bodies didn't dance. By the 1830s, when Victoria was still a princess, the groundwork was laid. Evangelical Christianity had moved from the margins to the mainstream of middle-class life. Medical science was beginning to provide rational arguments against bodily pleasures, and a new generation was growing up believing that their salvation, both spiritual and social, depended on absolute physical control. The stage was set for one of history's great moral panics. When a new dance craze swept across the English Channel in 1812, it would ignite a firestorm that would burn for nearly a century. That dance was the waltz, and to Victorian sensibilities, it was nothing less than vertical fornication. If you want to understand the Victorian horror at dancing, you need to understand what the waltz represented. Before the waltz, European social dances maintained careful distance between partners. The minuet, the cotillion, the country dances, all involved brief touches of gloved hands, prescribed movements, and constant separation. Partners might touch for a moment, then spin away. Everyone danced in groups, under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The waltz shattered every rule. For the first time in respectable society, a man would place his hand on a woman's waist. She would rest her hand on his shoulder. They would stand face to face, body to body, and spin around the room in an embrace that lasted the entire dance. To modern eyes, the waltz seems quaint, even prudish. To Victorians, it was shocking beyond words. Lord Byron, hardly a moral conservative, called the waltz voluptuous, and warned that no woman could waltz with a man and remain virtuous. The Times of London ran editorial after editorial condemning this imported German vice. One correspondent wrote in 1816, "I saw our daughters spinning like dervishes in the arms of strange men, their faces flushed, their bosoms heaving, their eyes bright with an unnatural light. How can any father witness such a sight and not fear for his child's virtue?" But the real panic began when medical authorities entered the debate. Dr. Donald Walker's 1836 book Exercises for Ladies warned that the waltz could cause hysteria, spinal deformation, and moral insanity. He wasn't alone. Medical journals published case studies of young women who, after waltzing, experienced nervous exhaustion, morbid thoughts, and uncontrollable physical sensations. We need to understand that Victorian medical science was obsessed with female bodies and their supposed fragility. Women were thought to have limited life force that could be depleted by mental exertion, physical activity, or emotional excitement. The waltz threatened all three. Dr. William Acton, one of the era's most influential medical writers, claimed that the spinning motion of the waltz could cause blood to pool in the reproductive organs, leading to nymphomania or uterine fury. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were published in respected medical journals, taught in medical schools, and repeated in advice manuals for young women. The message was clear. Dancing, especially waltzing, could literally drive women mad with lust. But the medical arguments reveal something deeper. Victorian society was terrified of female sexuality. The ideal woman was passionless, devoted entirely to her husband and children. Any hint of physical pleasure or bodily autonomy threatened the entire social order. If women could choose to dance, to experience physical pleasure in public, what else might they choose? The fear wasn't entirely about sex, though sex was certainly part of it. Dancing represented a loss of control over bodies, over social interactions, over the careful boundaries that kept society ordered. In the ballroom, a shop girl could dance with a gentleman. A clerk could hold the daughter of his employer. The normal rules of social interaction were suspended, replaced by the democracy of the dance floor. This democracy terrified those who benefited from rigid social hierarchies. If dancing could level social distinctions, even temporarily, what other levelings might follow? The anti-dance crusaders weren't just protecting virtue, they were protecting the entire Victorian social order. The case of Emma Hardinge illustrates how these fears played out in individual lives. Emma was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, raised in strict evangelical household in Manchester. In 1847, at age 18, she attended a cousin's wedding where dancing was permitted. She later wrote in her diary, The moment Mr. Thornton placed his hand upon my waist for the waltz, I felt a sensation I had never experienced, as if my very soul was awakening. The room spun, the music entered my blood, and for those 3 minutes, I forgot everything I had been taught about propriety and restraint. Emma's parents discovered her diary and reacted with horror. She was sent to live with an aunt in Scotland, forbidden any social activities, and subjected to daily lectures on the dangers of carnal desire. Her father wrote to her, "You have gazed into the abyss of sensuality, and only through God's grace can you be pulled back from its brink." Emma never danced again, eventually marrying a minister and becoming a fierce advocate against dancing herself. Her story was held up as both a warning and a success, a soul saved from the dance floor's damnation. The anti-dancing movement found its most powerful voices in the evangelical clergy who dominated Victorian religious life. These weren't marginal figures, they were the spiritual leaders of the middle class, filling vast churches and publishing best-selling sermon collections. Their influence extended far beyond Sunday services into every aspect of daily life. Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, could fill the 5,000-seat Metropolitan Tabernacle twice each Sunday. When he preached against dancing in 1865, his words reached millions through reprinted sermons. "The ballroom is the nursery of vice," he thundered. "No Christian can touch pitch without being defiled. Those who plead for dancing would do well to examine whether they have any religion at all." Spurgeon's argument was theological, but also deeply practical. He collected stories of fallen women and ruined men, tracing their destruction back to their first dance. One sermon featured Mary S., a minister's daughter who attended a single ball, met a charming stranger, and within 6 months was lost to virtue and family. Another told of Robert W., a promising young clerk who discovered gambling and drink through his dance hall associations. These weren't just sermons, they were multimedia performances. Spurgeon would act out the temptations of the ballroom, demonstrate the lascivious movements of modern dances while condemning them, and reduce his congregation to tears with tales of dancing's victims. His published sermons sold hundreds of thousands of copies, spreading the anti-dance message throughout the English-speaking world. But Spurgeon faced competition from an even more dramatic American import, Dwight L. Moody. When Moody toured Britain in 1873, he brought a new style of revivalism that made dancing a central battleground. His rallies featured testimonies from reformed dancers who described the ballroom as Satan's recruiting ground. One convert, a former dance instructor named Professor Johnson, toured with Moody, demonstrating how each dance position was designed to inflame lust. Professor Johnson's presentations were particularly effective because he combined insider knowledge with theatrical flair. He would begin by showing traditional folk dances, respectable, communal, with minimal physical contact. Then he would demonstrate how modern dances perverted these innocent forms. The waltz brought bodies together in unholy embrace. The polka encouraged wild abandon. The schottische, with its hopping movements, caused women's bodies to move in ways that inflamed male desire. "Observe," Johnson would say, placing his hand on an assistant's waist, "how this position brings the dancers into proximity unknown outside the marriage bed. Notice how the gentleman's hand presses against the lady's form, how their breathing mingles, how the motion of the dance creates friction between their bodies." His clinical descriptions, delivered with scientific precision, left audiences both horrified and fascinated. Many who came to scoff left converted to the anti-dance cause. The medical establishment provided crucial support. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the serial inventor, published Ladies' Guide in Health and Disease in 1882, devoting an entire chapter to the dangers of dancing. He claimed to have treated hundreds of women whose nervous conditions could be traced to their dancing habits. His treatments included cold baths, bland diets, and complete abstinence from any rhythmic movement. Kellogg's theories seem bizarre today, but they made sense within Victorian medical framework. He believed that the human nervous system operated like a battery with limited charge. Every excitement, mental, emotional, or physical, drained this vital force. Dancing combined all 3 forms of excitement, making it particularly dangerous. Young women who danced excessively would deplete their nervous energy, leaving them vulnerable to hysteria, neurasthenia, and moral insanity. His case files, preserved in the archives of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, make for disturbing reading. Miss R.T., age 22, admitted with severe nervous prostration. Patient reports attending dances 3 times weekly for past year. Symptoms include uncontrollable laughter, weeping without cause, and disturbing dreams of a sensual nature. Treatment, complete rest, milk diet, daily cold baths, and electrical stimulation to restore nervous balance. Dancing strictly forbidden. Perhaps the most influential voices were the women who led the social purity movement. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, made anti-dancing a cornerstone of her campaign. She argued that dancing was a women's issue. Young girls were the primary victims of dance hall seductions. Her 1889 book, How to Win, a book for girls, presented dancing as the first step on a slippery slope to prostitution. Willard's argument was sophisticated and played on maternal fears. She didn't claim that every girl who danced would become a prostitute, but she traced the stories of fallen women back to their first compromise. "It begins innocently enough," she would say in her lectures. "A respectable girl attends a dance, carefully chaperoned, but the music, the movement, the touch of her partner awakens sensations she doesn't understand. She begins to crave these feelings. She attends more dances with less supervision. She meets men outside her social circle. One thing leads to another, and soon she is ruined." The statistics Willard presented were compelling, if misleading. She surveyed prostitutes in major cities, finding that over 70% reported attending dances before their fall. What she didn't acknowledge was that 70% also reported eating bread, wearing shoes, and breathing air. The correlation between dancing and prostitution existed primarily in reformers' minds, but to worried parents, the connection seemed proved. These crusaders were remarkably organized. They formed anti-dancing leagues in major cities, published newspapers devoted to the cause, and lobbied for legislation. The Christian Mothers magazine devoted entire issues to the dancing threat. The Band of Hope Review published lurid illustrations showing the progression from ballroom to barroom to brothel. Sunday school curricula included anti-dance lessons, complete with songs like "I'd rather be a soldier in the temperance army than dance my soul away." They succeeded in banning public dancing in numerous towns, requiring licenses for dance halls, and establishing curfews for any establishment that permitted dancing. By 1885, over 200 municipalities in Britain had some form of anti-dancing ordinance. In Salford, dancing was banned entirely within city limits. In Leeds, dance halls could only operate if they provided a list of all attendees to the police. In dozens of smaller towns, dancing was restricted to private homes with written permission from the local minister. The movement had powerful allies beyond the pulpit. Industrialists supported it because workers who danced at night were tired the next day. A coalition of Manchester factory owners published a pamphlet in 1878 titled "Dancing and Industrial Efficiency," claiming that workers who frequented dance halls were 30% less productive than those who spent evenings in rational recreation. They instituted policies barring employment to anyone known to attend public dances. Educational authorities joined the crusade. Many schools banned dancing entirely, even traditional folk dances that had been part of physical education. The headmaster of Uppingham School wrote in 1883, "We must guard our charges against any activity that inflames the passions. Dancing, with its rhythmic movement and physical contact, is particularly dangerous during the turbulent years of adolescence." Students caught dancing faced expulsion. Even some feminists supported the anti-dance movement, seeing dancing as another way men exploited women's bodies. Josephine Butler, famous for her campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, wrote, "In the dance hall, young women are displayed like merchandise, circling in the arms of strangers who appraise their forms. Is this liberation, or is it a more subtle form of bondage?" Her support gave the anti-dance movement progressive credentials it wouldn't have had otherwise. But the Crusaders faced a problem. People kept dancing. The more thunderous the denunciations, the more alluring dancing became. Young people who might never have been interested in dancing were drawn by its forbidden nature. Underground dance clubs proliferated. Secret dancing societies formed in universities. The Victorian establishment had created the perfect conditions for rebellion. The story of the Oxford Dance Club illustrates this perfectly. In 1879, a group of students formed a secret society dedicated to practicing forbidden dances. They met in locked rooms, posted lookouts, and developed elaborate codes to avoid detection. Members included future members of parliament, judges, and even clergy. The thrill came as much from the secrecy as from the dancing itself. When the club was finally discovered in 1882, the scandal rocked the university. Several students were expelled, but within months, 3 new secret dance clubs had formed. To truly understand the Victorian anti-dancing phenomenon, we must examine how it intersected with the rigid class structure of the era. Dancing became a battlefield where anxieties about social mobility, gender roles, and racial mixing played out in the most physical way possible. The upper classes had their own elaborate dance culture that seemed immune to evangelical criticism. Aristocratic balls featured complex choreographed dances that had remained unchanged for generations. These were invitation-only affairs held in private homes, where every participant's bloodline was known and approved. When the Duchess of Devonshire hosted her annual ball, no preacher dared condemn it. The rules, it seemed, were different for those with titles. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on Victorian society. Middle-class evangelicals developed elaborate justifications for why aristocratic dancing was less dangerous than popular dancing. Upper-class dances, they argued, were governed by strict etiquette. Partners were carefully selected. Chaperones watched every movement. The dances themselves were stately and dignified, more like walking in patterns than actual dancing. The Countess of Warwick, writing in her memoirs years later, revealed the reality behind this facade. Our balls were as full of flirtation and intrigue as any public dance hall. We were simply better at hiding it. Behind fans and careful manners, as many assignations were made and hearts broken as in any East End dancing room. But we had titles and estates, so our morals were assumed to be above question. But when the working classes danced, that was different. Public dance halls, which proliferated in industrial cities, became symbols of everything the middle class feared. Here, factory girls danced with whoever asked. Sailors on shore leave spun shop assistants. The mixing was not just of bodies but of classes, and that was intolerable. The Holborn Casino, opened in 1863, became the most notorious example. This massive dance hall could hold 2,000 people and stayed open until dawn. For a small entrance fee, anyone could dance to a full orchestra. The Victorian press was scandalized. The Saturday Review called it a plague spot in the heart of London, where virtue is nightly sacrificed on the altar of Terpsichore. But what really happened at the Holborn Casino? Contemporary accounts from dancers themselves paint a different picture from the sensational newspaper reports. Sarah Bennett, a shop assistant who frequented the casino, wrote to her sister in 1871, "It's the only place where I feel truly alive. After 10 hours standing behind a counter, smiling at women who treat me like furniture, I can put on my best dress and dance. For those few hours, I'm not a servant or a drudge. I'm just Sarah, spinning to beautiful music." Police reports from the era reveal what really troubled authorities. It wasn't just the dancing, it was the social mixing. A report from 1871 noted with alarm that gentlemen of good family were seen dancing with females of the lowest class. Another worried that shop assistants assume airs above their station after dancing with their social superiors. Detective Inspector James Greenwood, assigned to investigate London's dance halls in 1876, went undercover to gather evidence. His report, meant to justify closure, instead revealed the gap between official hysteria and reality, expected to find dens of iniquity. Found mostly tired workers seeking honest recreation. Yes, there is drinking, but less than in ordinary public houses. Yes, men and women dance closely, but with no more impropriety than at society balls. The greatest crime appears to be that servant girls dance with the same enthusiasm as duchesses. The racial element added another layer of panic. As the British Empire expanded, colonial subjects and foreign sailors brought their own dance traditions to British ports. The sight of English women dancing to savage rhythms with men of different races sent the establishment into convulsions. One Liverpool minister declared in 1888 that allowing such mixing would mongrelize the British race within a generation. The panic reached fever pitch with the arrival of the cakewalk, an African-American dance that became popular in British music halls in the 1890s. The Manchester Guardian warned that this Negro dance, with its grotesque contortions, would corrupt British youth. The fact that young people of all classes eagerly learned the cakewalk only increased establishment horror. Mary Kingsley, the explorer and writer, observed the hypocrisy with characteristic wit. "I have seen English officials in West Africa condemn native dances as savage, then return home to waltz their wives around ballrooms. The only difference I can discern is that African dances often have religious or cultural meaning, while our dances serve primarily to display wealth and arrange marriages among the suitable classes." Dance halls became scapegoats for every social anxiety. Were crime rates rising? Blame the dance halls where criminals recruited accomplices. Were young women becoming too independent? Blame the dance halls where they escaped family supervision. Were workers demanding better conditions? Blame the dance halls where radical ideas spread along with the music. The gendered nature of the panic revealed deep fears about women's autonomy. Victorian ideology insisted that respectable women were naturally passive, requiring male protection and guidance. But in the dance hall, women chose their partners, initiated conversations, and experienced physical pleasure. They earned their own money and spent it on entrance fees and fancy dresses. They stayed out late and made their own decisions about whom to trust. This independence terrified a society built on female dependence. If women could support themselves and choose their own entertainment, why would they need husbands? If they could experience physical pleasure in dancing, what other pleasures might they seek? The dance hall represented a complete breakdown of the separate spheres that kept Victorian society stable. The response was predictably harsh. Factory owners fired girls caught frequenting dance halls. The Bryant and May Match Factory, site of the famous 1888 strike, had regulations forbidding employees from attending dances. When challenged about why male employees faced no such restrictions, management replied that men had natural moral strength that protected them from dancing's corrupting influence. Landlords evicted tenants who allowed dancing in their rooms. A typical lease from 1885 included clauses forbidding music, dancing, or rhythmic movement after 8 p.m. Violation meant immediate eviction. Poor families who might have supplemented income by hosting small dances were prevented from doing so. Churches expelled members who refused to give up dancing. The minutes of Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham record the 1882 trial of Sister Margaret Thompson, accused of attending a public dance. She defended herself eloquently. "I work 60 hours a week in a factory. My only joy is Saturday night at the dance hall. If God condemns me for seeking a few hours of happiness, then He is not the loving Father you preach about." She was expelled unanimously. Parents took extreme measures to prevent daughters from dancing. Middle-class families hired detectives to follow their daughters. Working-class parents locked daughters in their rooms on dance nights. Some sent rebellious daughters to convents or reformatories. The case files of the London Reformatory for Wayward Girls show that attending dances was the third most common reason for admission, after theft and sexual immorality. But the harder they pressed, the more creative the resistance became. Young people developed elaborate deceptions to attend dances. They created code words and secret signals. They bribed servants and climbed out windows. A whole underground culture developed around the forbidden pleasure of dancing. The window escape became so common, it entered popular culture. Music hall songs celebrated girls who climbed down drain pipes to attend dances. A popular postcard from 1885 showed a girl in a ball gown climbing out a window, with the caption where, "There's a waltz, there's a way." Parents responded by installing bars on windows, leading to the dark joke that middle-class homes looked like prisons. Perhaps nothing illustrates Victorian attitudes toward dancing better than the medical literature of the era. Respected physicians and scientists produced volumes of research proving that dancing caused everything from tuberculosis to insanity. These weren't quacks or charlatans. They were the leading medical minds of their time, published in prestigious journals and consulted by the wealthy. The medical argument against dancing rested on several interconnected theories that seem absurd today, but were deadly serious then. First was the concept of vital force, the idea that humans had a limited amount of life energy that could be depleted through physical or mental exertion. Dancing, with its combination of physical movement, emotional excitement, and mental stimulation, was seen as particularly draining. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States and a practicing physician in London, wrote extensively about dancing's dangers to young women. Despite being a pioneering feminist in many ways, she fully embraced Victorian medical orthodoxy when it came to dancing. Her 1878 book Counsel to Parents on the Moral Education of Their Children warned that dancing could trigger the premature development of the sexual instinct, leading to nervous exhaustion and moral degradation. Blackwell's theories were based on careful observation of her patients, filtered through Victorian assumptions. She noticed that young women who danced frequently often complained of fatigue, headaches, and emotional volatility. Rather than considering that these symptoms might result from tight corsets, poor nutrition, and limited exercise, she blamed the dancing itself. Her prescription was complete cessation of all dance activity, bed rest, and a diet of beef tea and milk. The symptoms attributed to dancing read like a medical encyclopedia. Dr. James Paget, surgeon to Queen Victoria, documented cases of dance-induced spinal irritation, characterized by back pain, weakness, and morbid mental states. His famous 1879 lecture at St. Bartholomew's Hospital described examining a young woman who had attended balls 3 nights. In succession, the patient presented with heightened color, rapid pulse, and complained of sensations she described as internal fluttering. Upon examination, I detected irregular heartbeat and unusual warmth in the abdominal region. These symptoms clearly indicated the dangers of excessive saltation. Dr. Thomas Laycock of Edinburgh University described choreic insanity, a condition where patients couldn't stop dancing, even in their sleep. He traced several cases to excessive indulgence in the waltz. His 1876 paper in the Edinburgh Medical Journal described a patient who would rise from her bed in the night and waltz about her chamber, entirely insensible to remonstrance, with her eyes closed and arms positioned as if holding an invisible partner. Modern readers might recognize this as a form of sleep disorder, but Laycock was certain dancing had damaged the patient's nervous system. The obsession with female reproductive health added another dimension. Victorian medicine believed women's bodies were dominated by their reproductive organs, particularly the uterus and ovaries. Any excitement or physical activity could cause these organs to become congested or inflamed, leading to hysteria. Dancing, with its rhythmic movements and emotional excitement, was particularly dangerous. Dr. William Acton, whose book The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs went through 8 editions, devoted an entire chapter to dancing's reproductive dangers. He claimed the rotating movements of the waltz created a centrifugal force that drew blood to the pelvic region. This pelvic congestion could lead to nymphomania in modest women or sterility in immodest ones. His theory was supported by numerous case studies, though he never explained how he determined which women were modest and which were not. Case studies from medical journals of the era make for disturbing reading. One 1882 report in The Lancet described Miss B, age 19, of previously good character, who, after attending 3 balls in 1 week, fell into hysterical fits, followed by periods of uncontrollable laughter and weeping. The treatment? Complete bed rest, a diet of milk and beef tea, and twice daily doses of laudanum. She was forbidden any music or rhythmic movement for 6 months. The treatment revealed as much as the diagnosis. Doctors prescribed isolation, bland diets, and sedatives, essentially punishing women for seeking pleasure. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's famous rest cure, used for various nervous conditions, specifically forbade any stimulating activities, especially dancing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, subjected to this treatment, later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a critique of medical attitudes toward women's mental health. Another case from the British Medical Journal in 1889 detailed a young man who developed dancing mania after attending nightly dances for a month. He reportedly couldn't stop his feet from moving, even during meals and church services. The prescribed cure included leg restraints, cold baths, and heavy doses of bromide. The journal noted with satisfaction that after 3 months of treatment, the patient has entirely lost his desire for saltatory exercise. But the medical establishment wasn't united. Some doctors, particularly younger ones trained in continental universities, began questioning the anti-dancing orthodoxy. Dr. John Chapman, writing in the Westminster Review in 1885, dared to suggest that moderate dancing might actually be healthy exercise. He was roundly condemned by his colleagues and accused of promoting vice. Chapman's crime was applying scientific method to the dancing question. He studied 50 young women who danced regularly and 50 who didn't, comparing their health over 2 years. His findings were heretical. The dancers had better cardiovascular health, fewer incidents of nervous exhaustion, and reported greater overall life satisfaction. The medical establishment dismissed his research as tainted by continental laxity. The most bizarre medical theory was dance-transmitted disease, not sexually transmitted, but literally caught from dancing itself. Dr. Robert Brunel Carter claimed in 1853 that certain nervous conditions could be spread through sympathetic vibration when bodies moved in rhythm together. He described dance halls as centers of nervous contagion, where healthy young people could catch hysteria, chorea, and other nervous disorders simply by proximity to affected dancers. Carter's theory gained support from observations of dancing plagues, historical incidents where groups of people danced uncontrollably. He connected medieval dancing manias to modern dance halls, suggesting that rhythmic movement could create a kind of mass hypnosis. The fact that these medieval incidents were likely caused by ergot poisoning or religious fervor didn't deter his theorizing. These medical theories had real consequences. Parents consulted doctors about their daughters' dancing habits. Young women were prescribed medical treatments for the disease of wanting to dance. Some were sent to asylums for refusing to give up dancing. The medical establishment's support gave the anti-dancing movement scientific credibility it wouldn't have had otherwise. The case of Helen Morrison illustrates the tragic results. In 1884, this Edinburgh shopkeeper's daughter was committed to the Royal Edinburgh Asylum after her parents consulted Dr. Thomas Clouston about her unnatural passion for dancing. Clouston, a respected alienist psychiatrist, diagnosed moral insanity manifested through choreographic obsession. Helen spent 3 years in the asylum, subjected to cold baths, restraints, and forced labor. Her crime? Sneaking out to attend dances after her parents forbade it. The intersection of medicine and morality created a powerful force for social control. When ministers preached against dancing, they could be dismissed as old-fashioned. But when doctors warned of medical dangers, backed by case studies and scientific terminology, resistance became much harder. How could parents risk their children's health? Yet cracks in the medical consensus were appearing. Physicians who actually studied dancers, rather than just treating those who came to them with problems, began noticing something inconvenient. Dancers were often healthier than non-dancers. They had better cardiovascular health, stronger muscles, and fewer cases of the nervous exhaustion that plagued sedentary Victorian women. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first women physicians in America and a researcher in Paris, published studies in the 1880s showing that moderate dancing improved women's health. She faced fierce criticism but continued her research, eventually demonstrating that many dance-induced illnesses were actually caused by tight corsets, poor nutrition, and lack of regular exercise, problems that dancing might actually help solve. Jacobi's 1885 paper, The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation, challenged every Victorian assumption about female fragility. She showed that physical activity, including dancing, during menstruation, caused no harm and often reduced discomfort. The medical establishment responded with fury. The British Medical Journal refused to publish her work, claiming it would unsettle the public mind on matters of established medical fact. While preachers thundered and doctors warned, ordinary Victorians kept finding ways to dance. The story of anti-dancing crusades is incomplete without the equally fascinating story of those who resisted, subverted, and ultimately defeated the prohibition. This resistance took many forms, from outright defiance to clever compromise, and involved every level of society. The most visible resistance came from the very people the Crusaders claimed to protect: young women. Despite, or perhaps because of, the intense pressure to remain pure and passive, many Victorian women embraced dancing as one of their few opportunities for physical freedom and social autonomy. Their letters and diaries reveal a hidden world of rebellion. Mary Carberry, daughter of a strict evangelical family, kept a secret diary from 1878 to 1882, detailing her dancing adventures. She developed an elaborate system of deception, telling her parents she was attending prayer meetings while actually learning the latest dance steps in friends' parlors. Her entry for June 15, 1880, captures the thrill. Danced the new Bohemian polka with Mr. R until past midnight. My heart has never beat so fast. Mother believes I was at Agnes's studying scripture. The guilt is worth the glory. Such deceptions were remarkably common. Young women created networks of mutual support, covering for each other's absences and sharing intelligence about safe venues. They developed codes in their letters. Studying French meant practicing dance steps. Tea with cousins indicated a planned dance attendance. Some even maintained complete duplicate wardrobes, keeping dance dresses at sympathetic friends' homes. The Diary of Alice Fenwick, discovered in a Birmingham attic in the 1970s, provides extraordinary detail about these networks. Alice, daughter of a Methodist minister, coordinated a group of 12 young women who helped each other attend dances. They created alibis, shared clothing, and even established a fund to bribe servants who might report their activities. Her entry for December 3, 1883, describes the system. Martha's housemaid now receives 2 shillings monthly to forget what time we return. Jane has persuaded her brother to claim we attend his chemistry lectures. With Lucy's aunt providing afternoon tea alibis, we can dance twice weekly without detection. The working classes, always more resistant to middle-class moralizing, simply ignored the prohibitions. In industrial cities, informal dances continued in pubs, warehouses, and even streets. When authorities closed one venue, another opened within days. The cat-and-mouse game between dancers and police became part of urban folklore. One famous incident in Manchester in 1884 saw 500 factory workers organize a freedom dance in direct defiance of new city ordinances. When police arrived to shut it down, they found the dancers had barricaded themselves inside and continued dancing while singing Rule Britannia. The standoff lasted 12 hours before authorities gave up, declaring the building unsafe rather than admit defeat. The aftermath of the freedom dance revealed the depth of working-class solidarity. When factory owners threatened to fire anyone who had participated, workers across Manchester threatened to strike. The owners backed down, though they instituted new rules requiring workers to sign pledges against attending public dances. Workers signed with assumed names or made marks they later claimed were forgeries. Even within respectable society, creative compromises emerged. Musical evenings featured rhythmic movement that wasn't technically dancing. Calisthenic exercises involved suspiciously dance-like movements performed to music. Tableaux vivants, living pictures, allowed participants to pose in dance positions without actually moving. Everyone knew these were thinly disguised dances, but the fiction allowed both sides to save face. Mrs. Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies in Bath advertised rhythmic health exercises that bore remarkable resemblance to popular dances. When questioned by concerned parents, Mrs. Pemberton would demonstrate the exercises' health benefits with medical charts and diagrams. That these exercises were performed to waltz music and required partners was purely coincidental, she insisted. The upper classes, as always, simply ignored rules that inconvenienced them. Society hostesses continued holding balls, secure in their social position. When criticized, they employed the ultimate Victorian weapon. They made critics seem vulgar for mentioning it. Lady Londonderry famously responded to a minister who condemned her ball. How curious that a man of God should know so much about the supposed evils of dancing. One wonders how he acquired such knowledge. The hypocrisy of the upper classes provided ammunition for radicals. The socialist newspaper Justice regularly contrasted police raids on working-class dance halls with descriptions of aristocratic balls. One 1887 editorial noted, Lady Ashworth's ball featured the same waltz that led to the arrest of 12 factory girls in Whitechapel. The only difference? Lady Ashworth's guests arrived in carriages rather than on foot. Some resistance came from unexpected quarters. Progressive ministers began arguing that dancing itself wasn't sinful, only its abuse. Reverend Stuart Headlam, an Anglican priest, scandalized colleagues by not only defending dancing, but actually dancing himself. He argued that the body was God's creation and rhythmic movement a form of worship. His 1892 pamphlet, The Dance in the Church, caused such controversy he was nearly defrocked. Headlam didn't just write about dancing, he practiced it. He organized church dances featuring traditional English country dances in parish halls. He argued these dances fostered community spirit and healthy exercise. Conservative clergy were horrified, but young people flocked to his services. His congregation grew from 50 to 500 in 2 years, though he was eventually transferred to a rural parish after complaints from fellow clergy. Artists and intellectuals provided intellectual ammunition for the resistance. Oscar Wilde wrote essays defending the divine right to pleasure. His 1891 essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, included a defense of dancing as essential to human development. To deny the body its expression through dance is to create a morbid and unnatural society. The Greeks understood this. We have forgotten it in our pursuit of a joyless respectability. George Bernard Shaw mocked anti-dance crusaders in his plays. His 1894 play Arms, and the man included a character who declares, "Dancing is immoral. Music is immoral. Everything that makes life worth living is immoral according to someone. I say, let us be immoral and happy, rather than moral and miserable." The aesthetic movement celebrated physical beauty and sensual pleasure as spiritual experiences. Walter Pater's famous injunction to burn, always with this hard, gem-like flame, was interpreted by many as endorsement of intense physical experiences, including dancing. Young aesthetes organized elaborate dance parties, featuring ancient Greek and Oriental themes, claiming cultural and artistic justification for what critics saw as decadent display. The commercial dance industry proved remarkably resilient and adaptive. When authorities banned public dance halls, entrepreneurs opened private clubs requiring nominal membership fees. The Criterion Club in London charged 1 penny for lifetime membership, making it technically private while remaining open to anyone. When specific dances were prohibited, dance masters simply renamed them. The banned turkey trot became the acceptable one-step. Creative categorization turned indecent gyrations into patriotic folk expressions. Dance teachers became underground heroes, maintaining studios despite social opprobrium and sometimes legal harassment. Madame Catty Lanner, who ran a successful dance academy in London, faced constant attempts to shut her down. She survived by cultivating powerful allies, including some who publicly opposed dancing but privately wanted their daughters to learn social graces. Madame Lanner's memoirs, published in 1908, revealed the extent of hypocrisy she witnessed. The same gentleman who denounced me from pulpits and council chambers would appear at my back door, asking if I might teach their daughters deportment, which everyone understood meant dancing. I kept 2 sets of books, one showing deportment lessons for the authorities, another recording dance instruction for my own purposes. Perhaps most subversive was the gradual normalization of dancing through sheer persistence, as more people danced without suffering the predicted consequences: madness, ruin, death. The warnings lost credibility. Young women who danced married well and raised healthy children. Young men who frequented dance halls succeeded in business. Reality stubbornly refused to confirm the Crusaders' predictions. The statistics told a story the anti-dance movement couldn't refute. By 1890, despite decades of prohibition efforts, London had more dance venues than ever before. A police survey counted over 300 establishments offering dancing, from elegant ballrooms to simple halls with piano accompaniment. The movement had failed to stop dancing. It had merely driven it into new forms and venues. By the 1890s, even Queen Victoria's own grandchildren were enthusiastic dancers. When the future Edward VII was criticized for his love of dancing, he reportedly replied, "I'd rather be thought fast than fossilized." The comment signaled a generational shift that would ultimately doom the anti-dance movement. The Prince of Wales' future Edward VII became an unwitting champion of dance liberation. His very public enjoyment of Parisian nightlife and enthusiasm for new dances made opposition seem provincial. When provincial newspapers criticized his dancing, London society rallied to his defense. The Countess of Warwick wrote, "If the future king can waltz, surely the rest of us need not fear for our souls." The Victorian anti-dancing movement offers a masterclass in how societies construct and enforce moral boundaries. Looking back with modern understanding, we can see the sophisticated mechanisms of social control at work, mechanisms that extend far beyond simple religious prohibition. The campaign against dancing succeeded, to the extent it did, by mobilizing multiple sources of authority simultaneously. Religious leaders provided moral weight, doctors added scientific credibility, educators shaped young minds, and legislators encoded prohibitions into law. This multi-pronged approach made resistance seem not just wrong, but dangerous, unhealthy, and illegal. The language used reveals the strategy. Dancing wasn't just immoral, it was a disease, an epidemic, a contagion threatening the body politic. This medicalization of moral issues would become a template for future social control efforts. By framing social behaviors as health issues, authorities could intervene in private lives under the guise of public welfare. Consider how the Times of London's coverage evolved. In 1850, dancing was a moral failing. By 1870, it was a social disease. By 1890, as the movement faltered, it had become a question of personal choice. The shifting language reflected changing power dynamics and the movement's declining credibility. Class anxiety provided the emotional fuel. The emerging middle class, insecure in their new prosperity, needed ways to distinguish themselves from both the decadent aristocracy and the unruly poor. Controlling bodily pleasure became a marker of respectability. The ability to resist dancing demonstrated the self-discipline that justified middle-class economic and political power. This class dimension becomes clear in enforcement patterns. Police records from London show that between 1870 and 1890, over 90% of dancing-related arrests occurred in working-class neighborhoods. Middle-class dance venues operated with minimal interference, while working-class halls faced constant raids. The law was applied selectively to reinforce social hierarchies. The focus on women's bodies revealed deeper power structures. In a society where women had few legal rights and limited economic opportunities, controlling their physical movement was essential to maintaining patriarchal order. If women could move freely in dance, what other freedoms might they claim? The dance floor became a proxy battlefield for women's broader liberation. The connection between dancing and women's rights was recognized by contemporaries. Susan B. Anthony, visiting England in 1883, observed, "The same forces that oppose women's suffrage oppose women's dancing. Both threaten male control over female bodies and choices. The dance floor is a political space, whether we acknowledge it or not. The role of shame deserves special attention." Victorian anti-dance crusaders were masters of public humiliation. They published names of people seen at dance halls. They organized prayer vigils outside dance venues. They created elaborate public confessions where reformed dancers detailed their degradation. Shame became a tool more powerful than law. The Birmingham Daily Post regularly published a roll of shame, listing young women seen entering dance halls. Employers used these lists to fire workers. Parents used them to restrict daughters. Marriage prospects were ruined by a single mention. The psychological warfare was devastating and effective, but the movement also revealed the limits of social control. Despite enormous pressure, people kept dancing. The human need for physical expression, social connection, and simple joy proved stronger than prohibition. Every attempt to suppress dancing created new forms of resistance, new venues, new justifications for this basic human activity. The economic dimension often goes unexamined. The anti-dance movement aligned conveniently with industrial capitalism's needs. Factory owners wanted workers who arrived rested and focused, not exhausted from late-night dancing. The ideal worker was disciplined, controlled, and found their pleasures in family and faith, rather than physical expression. Dancing represented time and energy diverted from productivity, yet capitalism also undermined the prohibition. Dance halls were profitable businesses, employing thousands and generating substantial tax revenue. The entertainment industry grew despite moral opposition, creating its own powerful lobby. Money, as always, complicated moral absolutes. By 1890, the dance industry in London alone employed over 10,000 people directly: musicians, dancers, hall staff, costume makers. Thousands more depended on it indirectly. When reformers pushed for stronger enforcement, business owners organized. The Licensed Victuallers Association, representing pub owners who hosted dances, became a powerful political force opposing prohibition. The movement's failure offers lessons about social change. Prohibition movements that deny basic human pleasures rarely succeed long-term. They may drive behaviors underground, create elaborate hypocrisies, and cause genuine suffering, but they cannot eliminate fundamental human needs. The Victorian anti-dance crusade ultimately collapsed not through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual erosion of credibility. By 1900, a new generation found the anti-dance hysteria incomprehensible. Young people who had grown up hearing dire warnings about dancing's dangers could see the obvious truth. Their dancing friends were neither mad nor ruined. The predictions of social collapse proved false. Society adapted to include dancing without falling apart. The racial and cultural dimensions of the prohibition reveal uncomfortable truths about Victorian society. Much anti-dance rhetoric focused on preventing primitive or savage influences from corrupting British civilization. African American dance styles, brought by sailors and performers, were particularly demonized. The fear of cultural mixing through dance exposed the deep racism underlying Victorian respectability. The arrival of the cakewalk in 1890s Britain created new panic. This African-American dance, with its exaggerated movements mocking white plantation owners' stiff dancing, terrified authorities who saw it as racial mockery and dangerous mixing. The Manchester Guardian warned that young people performing the cakewalk were abandoning Anglo-Saxon dignity for Negro antics. Yet this cultural exchange proved unstoppable. The very dances Victorians most feared, with their syncopated rhythms and expressive movements, would form the foundation of 20th century popular culture. The attempt to maintain cultural purity through dance prohibition failed spectacularly, preparing the ground for jazz, swing, and rock and roll. Understanding the Victorian anti-dance movement helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. Every generation seems to discover new threats to morality, new behaviors that will supposedly destroy civilization. The mechanisms of moral panic remain remarkably consistent: medical scaremongering, class anxiety, gender control, and racial fear. Only the targets change. As the 19th century waned, so did the power of the anti-dance movement. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion, like waves wearing away a cliff. By examining this decline, we can understand how moral panics lose their grip on society and what forces ultimately triumph over prohibition. The 1890s marked a turning point. A new generation of young adults, born during the height of anti-dance hysteria, came of age questioning their parents' prohibitions. They had heard the warnings their entire lives: dancing leads to madness, ruin, death. Yet they could see with their own eyes that dancers seemed remarkably similar to non-dancers in their life outcomes. The predictions hadn't come true. Margaret Thompson, writing in her diary in 1895, captured this generational shift. "Mother warns that dancing will ruin my prospects. Yet cousin Emma danced throughout her youth and married well. Aunt Sarah says dancing leads to madness. Yet the maddest person I know is Mrs. Whitmore, who has never danced in her life but spends her days hunting for sin in others." Perhaps the real madness is in the prohibition, not the dance. Economic prosperity played a crucial role. As Britain's middle class became more secure in their status, they needed less rigid boundary marking. The desperate respectability of the 1850s to 70s gave way to a more confident engagement with pleasure. Successful businessmen who had once banned their daughters from dancing now built ballrooms in their homes. They could afford to relax their vigilance. The influence of European culture couldn't be ignored forever. As travel became easier and cheaper, more Britons visited Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, where dancing was simply part of civilized life. They returned home questioning why Britain alone seemed to consider dancing dangerous. Continental sophistication began to seem more appealing than British prudishness. Travel writing of the era reflects this shift. Lady Florence Dixie, traveling through Europe in 1891, wrote, "In Vienna, I attended a ball where ministers' wives danced alongside shopkeepers, where grandmothers waltzed with evident joy, where dancing was celebration, not sin." Returning to London's dreary temperance meetings, I wondered, have we confused virtue with joylessness? Technology played an unexpected role. The phonograph, invented in 1877, brought music into homes in a new way. By the 1890s, middle-class families could purchase recorded dance music. Dancing shifted from public spectacle to private entertainment. Parents who would never allow their children in a dance hall found themselves tolerating parlor dancing to gramophone music. The phonograph advertisements of the era revealed changing attitudes. Early ads emphasized the device's educational value. Hear great sermons in your home. By 1895, they promoted dance music collections. The latest waltzes for home entertainment became a bestseller. Technology had made private dancing respectable by removing it from public view. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 symbolically ended an era. Edward VII, her pleasure-loving son, made no secret of his enjoyment of dancing, gambling, and other activities his mother had officially discouraged. The court, which set social standards, suddenly embraced the very pleasures it had condemned. Provincial moralists found themselves opposing not just popular taste, but royal example. Edward's coronation ball featured dancing until dawn, scandalizing old-guard moralists but delighting a nation ready for change. The Bishop of London's sermon against royal example encouraging sin was widely mocked. Punch magazine published a cartoon showing the bishop attempting to waltz alone, captioned "The Dance of Death," social death, that is. But the real change came from below. Working-class culture, strengthened by labor organization and rising wages, increasingly asserted its right to leisure. The music hall tradition, with its celebration of physical comedy and popular song, created space for bodily expression. Trade unions began organizing dances as fundraisers and social events, giving dancing respectability through association with worker solidarity. The London dock strike of 1889 included demands for the right to reasonable leisure, explicitly including dancing. When strikers won, they celebrated with a massive public dance. The Times, which had condemned dancing for decades, now praised the workers' disciplined celebration. Economic power had transformed moral perception. The suffragette movement, though not primarily concerned with dancing, challenged the entire structure of limitations placed on women. If women could hunger strike for the vote, chain themselves to railings, and endure force-feeding in prison, the idea that they were too fragile to waltz became absurd. Women's political awakening made their physical freedom inevitable. Emmeline Pankhurst herself addressed the connection in a 1908 speech. "They tell us we are too delicate to vote, too fragile to dance, too weak for any action but silent submission. Yet we endure police brutality, imprisonment, and forced feeding. Which requires more strength, the waltz or the hunger strike? We will have both our vote and our dance." World War I delivered the final blow to Victorian anti-dance sentiment. The horrors of mechanized warfare made concerns about the waltz seem tragically trivial. Young men facing death in the trenches wanted to dance with their sweethearts before shipping out. Parents who might have forbidden it couldn't deny what might be a last request. The war created a sense that life was short and pleasure precious. The letters from the front reveal this transformation. Lieutenant James Morrison wrote to his sister in 1916, "Tell Mother, I danced every dance at the officers' ball. After what I've seen here, the idea that God condemns the waltz is obscene. If there is sin in this world, it's in the trenches, not the ballroom." The influenza pandemic of 1918-19 added another layer of perspective. A disease that killed millions made the supposed health dangers of dancing laughable by comparison. Societies that had obsessed over dance-induced hysteria suddenly faced real medical catastrophe. The contrast revealed the manufactured nature of earlier health panics. Dr. Margaret Campbell, working in London during the pandemic, wrote in her diary, "2 years ago I was treating dance-induced nervous exhaustion. Now I watch young people die by the dozens from influenza. The tragedy is not that they danced, but that they had so little time to dance. If I survive this, I shall waltz at every opportunity." By 1920, the transformation was complete. The Jazz Age had arrived, bringing dances that would have given Victorian moralists apoplexy. The Charleston, with its wild leg movements and abandoned energy, made the waltz look formal and restrained. Young women cut their hair, raised their hemlines, and danced with a freedom their grandmothers couldn't have imagined. The speed of change was breathtaking. In 1910, a woman showing her ankles while dancing was scandalous. By 1925, she might dance in a dress that barely covered her knees, partnered with a man she just met, to music that incorporated African American rhythms. Every Victorian prohibition had been overturned in a single generation. Yet the victory wasn't total. The anti-dance movement left lasting scars on Anglo-American culture. Certain religious communities maintained prohibitions well into the 20th century. Some American towns banned dancing into the 1980s. The film Footloose 1984, about a town where dancing is illegal, wasn't pure fiction. It reflected ongoing realities in parts of America. Elmore City, Oklahoma maintained its dancing ban from 1898 to 1980. When high school students finally challenged the prohibition, they faced death threats. The last arrest for public dancing in America occurred in 1987 in Purdy, Missouri. These weren't historical curiosities, but living remnants of Victorian moral panic. More subtly, the Victorian suspicion of bodily pleasure shaped attitudes that persist today. The disconnect between mind and body, the equation of physical expression with danger, the need to justify pleasure through health benefits, all these carry echoes of Victorian anti-dance ideology. We may dance freely now, but we often do so despite lingering cultural anxieties rather than in their absence. Consider how we frame exercise today. We rarely say we move for joy. Instead, we cite health benefits, calorie burning, disease prevention. The need to justify physical pleasure through utility is a Victorian inheritance. We've medicalized movement in a different direction, but the disconnection from simple bodily joy remains. The international perspective reveals how uniquely Anglo-American the anti-dance obsession was. While British and American Victorians agonized over the waltz, the rest of Europe simply danced. Latin American, African, and Asian cultures maintained rich dance traditions throughout the period. The prohibition was never universal. It was a specific pathology of a specific culture at a specific time. A Japanese visitor to London in 1888 wrote home in bewilderment, "The English have the strangest customs. They admire our tea ceremony, which involves sitting perfectly still, but condemn dancing, which brings joy and health. They seem to have confused stillness with virtue and movement with vice. In Japan, we dance at our festivals without shame. Are we more moral or simply more sensible?" Understanding this history helps us recognize the contingent nature of moral absolutes. Behaviors that seem obviously dangerous to one generation appear harmless or even beneficial to the next. The Victorians weren't stupid or uniquely repressive. They were people operating within their cultural framework. Just as we operate within ours, their framework happened to construct dancing as dangerous, just as our framework constructs other behaviors as threats. As we reach the end of this journey through Victorian anti-to-dance hysteria, it's worth stepping back to consider what this strange chapter of history teaches us. The story of how an entire society convinced itself that dancing was a pathway to damnation isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror reflecting timeless patterns of human behavior and social control. First, we see how moral panics operate. They require a perfect storm of conditions: social anxiety, economic change, threatened power structures, and charismatic leaders who can channel fear into action. The Victorian anti-dance movement had all these elements. The Industrial Revolution disrupted traditional ways of life. The emerging middle class needed to establish its identity. Women's roles were beginning to shift. Into this uncertainty stepped preachers and doctors offering simple explanations and clear enemies. The role of science, or pseudoscience, in legitimizing social control deserves special attention. Victorian doctors didn't consciously lie about dancing's dangers. They observed real symptoms in their patients and constructed theories to explain them. That these symptoms might have been caused by tight corsets, social repression, and lack of exercise, rather than dancing itself, didn't occur to them. They saw what their worldview prepared them to see. This selective vision affects every generation. We laugh at Victorian doctors diagnosing dance-induced hysteria while potentially missing our own biases. What behaviors do we pathologize based on cultural assumptions rather than evidence? What freedoms do we restrict in the name of protection? The Victorian example should make us humble about our own certainties. Consider modern parallels. We pathologize screen time while ignoring that many children use screens to connect with friends, learn new skills, and express creativity. We worry about video game addiction while celebrating equally consuming hobbies like reading or sports. Our medical authorities warn about social media's dangers. With the same certainty, Victorian doctors condemned dancing. Are we seeing clearly, or are we, like them, seeing what our cultural moment prepares us to see? The gendered nature of the panic reveals how threats to patriarchal control get masked as concern for women's welfare. Victorian men didn't say we're terrified of women's autonomy. They said we must protect delicate females from harm. This pattern repeats whenever women's freedoms expand. The specific freedoms under attack change, but the framework remains remarkably consistent. Modern dress codes, particularly in schools, echo Victorian logic. Girls' clothing is policed to prevent distraction or maintain appropriate standards. The underlying message, that female bodies are inherently disruptive and must be controlled, would be perfectly familiar to Victorian anti-dance crusaders. We've simply shifted the battleground from the dance floor to the classroom. Class dynamics shaped every aspect of the anti-dance movement. Elite dancing was cultured, working-class dancing was dangerous. Private balls were social necessities. Public dance halls were dens of vice. The ability to define which pleasures were acceptable and which were dangerous was itself a form of class power. Those definitions protected existing hierarchies, while appearing to protect public morals. Today's distinction between raves dangerous and galas sophisticated mirrors Victorian class anxieties. Electronic dance music events face police scrutiny and moral panic, while classical music galas receive public funding. The substances consumed might be different, ecstasy versus champagne, but the class-based moral distinction remains. Working-class pleasures are still more likely to be criminalized than elite ones. The movement's failure teaches us about the limits of prohibition. Human beings have danced for thousands of years across every culture. Attempting to suppress such a fundamental form of expression was doomed from the start. Yet the attempt caused real suffering. Families divided, careers destroyed, individuals pathologized for normal desires. The cost of feudal prohibition movements is always paid most heavily by the vulnerable. We also see how resistance operates. The Victorian anti-dance movement generated its own opposition through excess. The more extreme the rhetoric became, the less credible it seemed. Young people who might have accepted moderate restrictions rebelled against total prohibition. Underground dance cultures developed more vibrant and transgressive forms than might have emerged without suppression. The economic dimensions remind us that moral panics often serve material interests. Factory owners benefited from workers who didn't stay out late dancing. Churches benefited from entertainment alternatives that required their mediation. Doctors benefited from treating dance-related conditions. Following the money reveals practical motivations behind seemingly pure moral concerns. Most importantly, this history humanizes the Victorians. It's easy to mock their prudishness and congratulate ourselves on our enlightenment, but they were people trying to make sense of rapid change, protecting their children as they understood protection, building the best society they could envision. Their vision seems limited now, but will ours seem any less limited to future generations? What moral panics will future historians study from our era? Will they laugh at our fears about screen time the way we laugh at dance-induced hysteria? Will they wonder how we could restrict children's play in the name of safety while ignoring larger threats? Will they see our anxieties about social media as clearly as we see Victorian anxieties about dancing? The dance panic also shows how pleasure itself becomes political. In societies based on hierarchy and control, joy is dangerous. If people can create happiness through their own bodily movement, they're less dependent on approved sources of satisfaction. Dancing is democratic. Anyone can do it, anywhere, for free. That accessibility threatens systems that depend on scarcity and control. The echoes in our own time are impossible to ignore. Every generation finds new threats to children, new behaviors that will supposedly destroy society. Video games, social media, whatever technology or behavior emerges next, each faces its own moral panic. The Victorian example suggests we should be skeptical of claims that any single behavior threatens civilization itself, yet we shouldn't overcorrect into pure relativism. Some behaviors genuinely are harmful. The Victorian era wasn't in believing that society needed moral standards. It was in locating immorality in the wrong places. While they obsessed over dancing, actual evils like child labor, poverty wages, and imperial exploitation continued unchecked. Moral panics often distract from real moral issues. Today, while we panic about teenagers dancing on TikTok, we ignore rising inequality, climate change, and systemic injustices. Like Victorians obsessing over the waltz while children worked in mines, we focus on individual behaviors rather than structural problems. Moral panics serve power by redirecting reform energy toward harmless targets. Finally, this history celebrates human resilience. Despite enormous pressure, people kept dancing. They found ways to express joy, create community, and claim bodily autonomy, even in the most repressive circumstances. That stubborn insistence on pleasure in the face of prohibition gives hope. Whatever moral panics we face, whatever freedoms come under attack, people will continue to find ways to dance, literally and metaphorically. The Victorian anti-dance movement failed, but its failure taught valuable lessons. It showed that pleasure is political, that bodily autonomy threatens hierarchies, that moral panics reveal more about the panicked than the threat. Most importantly, it showed that the human spirit, expressed through movement and music, ultimately cannot be contained by prohibition. In the end, the dance always wins. As we close this exploration of Victorian anti-dance sentiment, it's worth considering what remains of this peculiar moral panic in our modern world. The echoes are more present than we might think, woven into the fabric of contemporary culture in ways both obvious and subtle. In certain religious communities, particularly in parts of the American South and Midwest, dancing prohibitions persisted well into the late 20th century. Baptist churches and fundamentalist Christian schools maintained bans on dancing into the 1990s and beyond. The reasoning had evolved, less about medical hysteria, more about avoiding appearance of evil, but the essential suspicion of bodily pleasure remained. Bob Jones University in South Carolina prohibited dancing until 1996. Pensacola Christian College in Florida still forbids dancing as of 2023. Students who violate the rule face expulsion. The language has modernized. They speak of maintaining distinctiveness rather than preventing hysteria, but the fundamental distrust of physical expression continues. The broader culture absorbed Victorian anxieties in transformed ways. Consider how we approach children's dancing today. Dance recitals for young children often provoke debates about age-appropriate movements and costumes. The concern that dancing might prematurely sexualize children carries distinct Victorian echoes, even when expressed in contemporary language about child development and protection. Social media amplifies these anxieties. Videos of children dancing trigger comment wars about propriety, with language that could be lifted from Victorian sermons, protecting innocence, maintaining childhood, appropriate boundaries. The vocabulary updates, but the underlying fears remain constant. We've simply moved the moral panic from dance halls to TikTok. Our relationship with our bodies still bears Victorian scars. The mind-body dualism that positioned physical pleasure as suspicious persists in how we discuss exercise, requiring health justifications for movement that brings joy. We're more comfortable saying we dance for cardio than admitting we dance because it feels good. The need to rationalize pleasure through utility is a Victorian inheritance. Fitness culture reveals this disconnection. We've turned joyful movement into punishing regimens. Feel the burn, no pain, no gain, earn your rest. The language of modern exercise contains echoes of Victorian body discipline. We've replaced moral justifications with health ones, but the suspicion of pleasure remains. The medicalization of moral issues, pioneered by Victorian anti-dance crusaders, became a standard template for social control. Throughout the 20th century, behaviors deemed socially undesirable were transformed into medical conditions requiring treatment. The DSM's evolution shows this pattern, with various behaviors moving in and out of diagnostic categories based on social attitudes rather than purely medical criteria. Modern nightclub culture still navigates tensions between pleasure and danger that Victorians would recognize. Discussions about club safety, drink spiking, and appropriate behavior echo Victorian concerns about dance halls as dangerous spaces. While the specific fears have evolved, the fundamental anxiety about spaces where people gather to dance and potentially lose control remains. The #MeToo movement revealed how dance spaces can indeed be sites of exploitation and assault, seeming to validate some Victorian concerns. Yet the solution hasn't been to ban dancing, but to create better consent culture and accountability. We've learned to separate the activity from its potential for abuse, something Victorians couldn't or wouldn't do. Technology has created new dance-related moral panics. TikTok dances performed by young people generate familiar anxieties about premature sexualization and moral corruption. Online discourse about whether certain dances are appropriate for certain ages could be lifted directly from Victorian advice manuals, with only the specific moves changed. The WAP dance controversy of 2020 replayed Victorian arguments with stunning precision. Critics warned about corrupting youth, destroying innocence and promoting immorality. Defenders argued for bodily autonomy and freedom of expression. The platforms were different, Twitter versus pulpits, but the fundamental conflict between control and freedom remained unchanged. The globalization of dance culture that Victorians feared has largely occurred, but as enrichment rather than degradation. K-pop choreography, Latin American reggaeton, African dance movements flow freely across borders. The cultural mixing through dance that terrified Victorians has become a celebrated aspect of global youth culture. Yet even in our supposedly liberated age, certain dance forms remain controversial. Pole dancing, twerking, and other explicitly sexual dance forms provoke debates that echo Victorian concerns about respectability and women's bodily autonomy. The specific boundaries have shifted, but the existence of boundaries around acceptable movement remains. The class dynamics of dance have evolved but not disappeared. Ballet and ballroom dancing carry high culture prestige. Hip-hop and street dancing, despite mainstream popularity, still face respectability challenges. The ability to define which forms of dance are artistic versus vulgar remains a form of cultural capital. Perhaps most tellingly, we've retained the Victorian tendency to locate social anxieties in young people's entertainment choices. Just as Victorians saw dancing as a threat to youth, we cycle through panics about music, video games, social media. Whatever captures young people's attention and exists outside adult control, the story of Victorian anti-dance hysteria ultimately affirms human resilience and the persistence of joy. Despite the best efforts of preachers, doctors, legislators, and parents, people kept dancing. They dance still. In every generation, in every culture, humans find ways to move their bodies to rhythm, to connect with others through shared movement, to express what words cannot capture. This isn't just about dancing. It's about the human insistence on pleasure despite prohibition, connection despite isolation, freedom despite control. The Victorian attempt to stop dancing failed not because their arguments were weak, though they were, or their science was bad, though it was, but because they were fighting against something essential to human nature. As we face our own moral panics and social anxieties, the Victorian example offers both warning and hope. The warning: how easy it is for an entire society to convince itself that harmless pleasures are dangerous, how quickly pseudoscience can legitimate oppression, how fear can override compassion and common sense. The hope that human joy ultimately proves stronger than prohibition, that people will always find ways to dance. In the end, the Victorians were right about one thing: dancing is powerful. It brings people together across boundaries of class, race, and gender. It allows physical expression in societies that prefer control. It creates joy in bodies taught to distrust pleasure. It affirms life in cultures obsessed with death. No wonder they feared it, and no wonder it survived. The dance continues, as it always has and always will. The music changes, the steps evolve, the venues transform, but the essential human act of moving to rhythm persists. In that persistence lies a profound truth about human nature. We are creatures meant to dance, and no amount of prohibition can change that fundamental fact. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Victorian anti-dance movement. Not that Victorians were uniquely repressive or foolish, but that human joy, expressed through dance, through music, through bodily freedom, is ultimately irrepressible. They tried to stop the dance. They failed. And in their failure lies our freedom. Looking back at Margaret, practicing her waltz steps alone in her bedroom in 1875, we can see both tragedy and hope. The tragedy is that she had to hide, that her natural desire to move to music was treated as sin. The hope is that she danced anyway, even if only to imaginary music in the privacy of her room. Across the decades, we can admire her defiance and celebrate that her great-great-granddaughters dance freely in clubs, at weddings, in their kitchens, wherever music moves them. The Victorians lost their war on dancing. Thank God they did. because in losing they gave us a gift, the reminder that joy is stronger than fear, that bodies will move despite prohibition, that the human spirit finds a way to dance, even in the darkest times. Their failure is our freedom. Their fear is our celebration. Their prohibition is our permission to dance, always and forever, until the music stops, which is to say, never. So dance. Dance badly. Dance joyfully. Dance alone in your room like Margaret, or in crowded clubs, or at weddings, or in your kitchen while making breakfast. Dance because you can, because they couldn't stop it, because every step is a small victory over those who would control joy. Dance because the Victorians were wrong, because pleasure isn't sin, because your body is yours and movement is its language. Dance because the story of Victorian anti-dance hysteria teaches us this above all. They can try to stop the music, but the dance goes on.